Hello and welcome to the Incinerator Art Award 2020 Symposium. My name is Jake Treacy, curator at Incinerator Gallery, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I broadcast today, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to their spirits, ancestors, elders and community members past and present, and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Furthermore, I pay respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be tuning into today's conversation. As part of the Incinerator Art Award 2020, we will be exploring 4 key themes of social justice across 4 video conversations, underscoring how art may bring about social change. In this talk, I'm joined by artists Shel DeStefano, Devi Sheharam, Alham Esragian, Georgia Banks, and Roberta Rich, as we explore the theme identity and community. I've asked the artists 4 provocations. How has identity or community informed your work for the Incinerator Art Award? What does identity or community look like, smell like, feel like, taste or sound like? How do we connect and/or record identity or community, especially during this time of COVID? And perhaps we can further explore ideas surrounding intersectionality. Shel, perhaps we can open the discussion with yourself. Could you tell us a little bit about your work in the Incinerator Art Award and how it explores the silencing and discrimination of the deaf community?
Sure. Well, deaf voice is really something like we have to raise the awareness of, and this includes myself. So recently, I had the realization, like within my studying of my master's at university currently, the voice of many deaf people is still very oppressed. I think the research is that we're still all looking at where it has begun, and it's within the education and teaching system. For over 60 years, we've always been put aside. If you're deaf, you can't, or you don't have that voice. Teachers wouldn't bother to make that communication. So growing up, as I've become older, I've realised the comprehension skills weren't present. The understanding of life just wasn't actually imparted. So we need to have that awareness of how we can stand up for our requirements, what our needs are, how we can explain and express ourselves. And it's living between the 2 worlds of the deaf and the hearing. So we need to be able to stand up. So hopefully there is a bit of a change coming within that. And obviously there's so much autism. It's called autism because that occurs regularly every day to the community. Same, for example, within Bunnings, just a generalised shop. I've been there in the past, and I recently visited and I wrote down a question of what my requirement was, and they spoke back to me with a mask on, and I'm like, I'm deaf. How can I communicate with you? And they still continue to keep talking, and I'm writing again going, I'm deaf. You need to actually communicate with me. And they refuse to write anything down. And I'm like, well, I can't lip read if you're wearing a mask and I can't hear you at all. And then they still continued to keep going. And I ended up walking away, and I had a lady who was standing behind me who tapped me on the shoulder and said, would you need some help? She actually lowered her mask so we could communicate. And I was so appreciative of that small interaction. So it's those generalized frustrations that we see every day. Autism happens in my life very frequently. It happened within my school life. when I was trying to communicate in sign, my hands were hit repeatedly because they didn't want me to communicate that way. I would try have conversations. That was a natural form of me to communicate and wasn't allowed. I was told I had to be oral. So now I'm finding as I get older, lip reading is a very challenging and tiring thing to do on a daily basis. And I much prefer to meet halfway. I'm happy to type things on my phone. I'm happy to sign. I'm happy to mime, to communicate. But I find that it's not reciprocated. And also autism, like people say, oh, don't worry about it, doesn't matter, I'll tell you later. And I don't like that either. Deaf people don't like that. Like, we want to be included. We want to know what's happening and what's occurring within our community and within our environment. So it's an ongoing frustration. Currently, there are examples of discrimination and autism and intersectioning as well within the education and university environments and TAFE. So we need to be able to progress in the community to have, like, we've got fantastic teachers and we have to be able to have that ongoing access to have captions, to have note takers, to have interpreters in all of our seminars and forums, so that, or having those opportunities to meet with those people as well. Some parts of university do exclude deaf students. They limit the access. They don't allow us to have specific things that we require. They just say, no, that access isn't provided. So it feels like we become trapped because we're not able to be heard. Like, deaf people do have the right to be heard. We have the right to be able to have that access without being refused. To be refused simple as captions, or to be refused Auslan, which is our first language. It feels very trapping as well. And within the hearing communities, like, you can all communicate quite easily throughout an app with your phones. You can actually often set up your own captions, which is like a speech to text kind of application or program. And hearing people who use those, it tends to be a fairly cheap and easily accessed platform. Whereas for us as the deaf community, it tends to be a bit more expensive, and people say, oh, we don't have the funding to cover that access. But I'm like, hold on, I have the right to be heard like everybody else, to create that equal environment. And it's globally, we need to be able to have that access. It's like universal design should be that everybody has access within the community that they live in. So that point there has made me realise that it is universal design it's currently designed for the hearing community. And so we don't have that universal design for all participants. And I'm here too, and I want to be heard and I want to express. I'm on a program at the moment with some really great friends including deaf people on a regular basis, to be able to express in our first language of Auslan, and to have captions as well. It's really important. So yeah, I guess that's my long story, but yeah, there's a lot to explain.
There certainly is, Shell. Thank you so much for taking the time for allowing us to navigate those in-between spaces that you often encounter as well in everyday life and also within the art world as well. The idea of access is truly
Yeah,
important.
making like live performance accessible.
Yes.
Yeah, and textile and those kinds of things. It's a really strong point.
Shell, you've really you've caught me to my segue before I could get there first. So thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your work in the Incinerator Art Award. Could you tell us a little bit more about the poem and about sewing and also about the performance? Because the act of sewing and in the performance, your hands are really present. You're wearing this black attire and sort of sink into or appear forward at the same time beneath a veil. And that really highlights those two worlds that you stride, that you walk within.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And that it was the big focus point. The hands was what I was focusing within to make people realise. And that's why I didn't caption the video either. I wanted people to use their eyes to actually see what it's like for us during COVID, to make people realise there needs to be captions or an interpreter to understand what's actually taking place. So that was part of the project as well. And I do believe that the video should have captions so that hearing people can feel included. But that one specifically doesn't, because I was focusing on a different perspective. And you're right, the sewing is with the hands, and how I work and craft with the hands informs my practice as a deaf artist. And as well, the research within the deaf events, and like, it's quite interesting to see where it's come from, a very interesting place.
Thank you, Shell. It is a really powerful work, and it does translate from that physical space into a digital space. As does everyone's work in this year's award in particular. During COVID, we are navigating new terrains and we're not leaving people behind. So thank you for sharing your story, Shell. Perhaps we can circle around to talk further about that at the end of our conversation. Debbie, I wanted to open up the floor to yourself now and to talk about your work in the Incinerator Art Award, which confronts the social dynamics of your home community in South India. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this work, and especially some of the symbolism painted into the work, because I know that it resonates both on a personal level as well as a community narrative.
So like you said, it is focusing on my home community in South India. It basically is tackling the patriarchy, right? So it is a common scene as well as an experiential thing for me of men occupying public space and feeling entitled to that space as well. And almost loitering. There's actually a term called vayunoki, which means to stand around and gape, right? Like to stand around and check out women. And it is quite oppressive, especially when it runs inherently through the culture and it infiltrates besides on the street, but into your families and in your homes as well. So the series is depicting men cut off at the waist because I feel like it contains all the information it requires there, as in who they are. It's almost like an assembly of limbs, anonymous limbs. So them gathered in conversation that we are not privy to, first of all. And then also wrapped around in this white, like a loincloth or wraparound, however you want to call it, which is again tied into where I'm from. It's culturally, it's basically our attire, which doesn't have any social status and doesn't have any casteism to it. So it's quite egalitarian, but at the same time, it's worn with a certain sense of pride, when in reality, it's also quite, it's oppressive in itself, right? Then what I've done is I've put these things on the floor. So each painting has something else. And this one specifically has jasmine flowers. Jasmine flowers is something that women pluck, create little garlands out of, and adorn in their hair to make it smell nice. Or again, you make garlands out of it and say, give it as temple offerings. So in this painting, there are these jasmine flowers that have fallen. And so it's supposed to depict the passing of time. The flowers have fallen and these men are still there, right? The dominance or the dominance is still weighing on the community. And then the other aspect is the leaf. So the leaf in the man's hand as a package, as well as what's on the floor, is actually a lotus leaf or banana leaf that you use to package flowers to give as temple offerings or to buy from a florist and take home. And so it's basically culturally tied elements that I've detailed the paintings with to try and depict the passing of time, as well as it's almost, some people interpret it as the feminine side to this very male dominated space that I've created in each painting. Yeah, that's, I guess, a summary.
The story behind it is really rich and very fragrant, Debbie, and it does sort of demonstrate ideas of oppression, as Shell was talking about before as well, and notions of through education and presence to find liberty. And there's so many layers to the work, even to the fact, could you talk maybe a little bit about the technical elements of how the work is sort of built up and how you find that translucency with the sari, perhaps? So
basically the technique is quite laborious. So it's a process that is additive as well as subtractive. So I'm basically layering a lot of paint and then removing layers of paint to create the folds in my fabric. And where I'm from is actually very tropical and green and lush, and like we're known for our monsoons, rains, etc. But I've tried to strip that away from the visual as well to show more of a weathered, worn sort of space, and also an exterior space. Yeah, the process is so laborious and almost depleting. It's just part of the process of my negotiation with the subject matter, I think. Yeah.
Do you find it a moment to reflect or to meditate as well, Devi? I mean, I remember in an earlier conversation, we were talking about relocation for yourself about 4 years ago to Naarm, Melbourne, and that sense of identity and community that exists between or beyond place. And I think that this conversation might sort of flow into some further dialogue that we talk about, but was there anything that you would like to comment upon that?
Yeah, absolutely. Previously, all my works were about trying to portray, basically evoke empathy, devoid of our cultural or historical backgrounds. Versus this was completely different, where I was struggling to come up with a theme once I moved here of what moved me. And for the first time ever, I actually looked inwards and into my own relationship with self and community, I guess. And that's where the series was born, out of an acute sense of discomfort and unease. And this series, even though it's a series of almost repetition of like just new compositions of similar compositions, but in new configurations, yes, it's not something that I expect will resolve, but I'm hoping that it's something that will encourage recognition of this fact of my reality that I'm depicting.
It's a really important work, Devi, and I know even just not having seen it in the reel at the moment, but seeing the actual dimensions of the work, I look forward to seeing it hanging in the gallery space some point in the future. But maybe to pick up on that idea of location and place, Alham, I would like to continue the conversation into your work that's participating in the Incinerator Art Award and ideas of displacement. Your work expresses your mother's experience of displacement in particular after escaping Iran during the 70s revolution. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about this video work and the importance of spirituality.
Thank you so much, Jake. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on this land of which I'm presenting, the Whadjuk people of Noongar, and pay my respects to the traditional landowners past, present and future. So this work is more so looking at the people of my community, the Baha'i community that were persecuted during 1979 in Iran. And it is looking at their the emotional journey that they did partake in of exile and displacement. And a strong factor was this essence of spirituality. The reason for why the Baha'i community were persecuted was based on faith, was based on belief, and that that was pushed down by the revolution, and that was not accepted, and that actually meant that if you did not recant your faith, your belief, then you would be imprisoned, killed, or exiled. And that's what happened with my mom. And in essence, with this video, I am in a way celebrating faith because of celebrating spirituality, because that whatever anyone believes in, regardless of where you come from, race, class, borders, differences, gender, I think that if we persevere together, we can make a journey for a unified world. And this video is starting this crux of my practice, in which I'm looking at to why it happened, how it happened, and moving forward, how can we break the cycle so it doesn't happen again?
Audio in this work is really important as well, Arham. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the singing that we can hear in the work and that collaboration.
Definitely. So that song is a poem by Toher, a Persian poet, and someone that brought women's rights to the forefront in Persian history. And my second cousin, who is in US, sang it for me in a Persian form of singing called Tazhib. And that's sort of something I've been exploring throughout my work, throughout my practice, this beauty of Persian culture through the dance, through the music, and actually finding a way to see how does that mesh in with my generation, who has been brought up here, who has grown in this society, who we are not allowed to go back to Iran because of how unsafe it is. So we're denied that access or that right to see our heritage, to see our motherland. And in essence, I am trying to make sense of that through the work and actually learn about my culture in these various forms, which I feel incredibly honored by. And it is through this music, it is through this these different artistic practices that I've engaged with my community. And in saying that, it's quite, it's a way of creating connection, because I think we can agree, or most of us can agree, that all cultures have this essence, this relationship with music, with poetry, with literature of their culture, and it's a way of connecting with others using these performances. So it's not just about what you believe in, but what is the essence, what is the humanity that can be found in our differences, and that should be celebrated.
Very much so. I think language as the importance of cultural celebration is something that unites many of the works included in the Incinerator Art Award. It relates into what Shell was discussing earlier as well. Perhaps we can circle back around to talk a little bit about that. Georgia, I would like to also invite you into the conversation with your work, as your work takes a different strand, and when we talk about identity and community, with some similar threads that start to, I can see, being pulled in from our discussion already. Your work documents the journey of you auditioning for a reality TV dating show. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that experience and how identity becomes something that is maybe seen as performative within the sphere of reality TV or social media, politics, perhaps even within the art world as well.
For sure. So the work that's in this prize is a video. I spent a year auditioning for a reality TV dating show. It was a very long process. And this video is a reenactment of one of the many auditions that I had. It was with the executive producers. I suppose I started becoming interested in reality TV and the role that it plays in our culture, the way that we consume reality TV, the way that it shapes how we see the world. Particularly, it's something that we watch as entertainment, it's something we watch with our guards down, but it very much perpetuates a white hetero world as the norm, and particularly feeds very strongly into gender stereotypes. What is a good person? What is a bad person? What kind of punishment do bad people deserve, particularly women with any level of sexual autonomy? Of course, reality TV is super well known for queer baiting, an issue very close to my heart. So this video is my audition trying to get on the show. I got really close. I got down to the final 50 applicants from 10,000. I think it speaks to what somebody producing a reality TV show is looking for in a human being. I mean, they basically take everything about you, anybody, like we're all very complex humans, and they just boil it down to like, this person will be good on the show because they'll fight with this person, and we can make the audience think this way about, about queer people. Or wouldn't it be great for ratings if this person broke down on TV talking about their sexual trauma? So yes,
I think that point, Georgia, as well, of to translate that, the idea that TV and media shapes identity. It shapes ideas surrounding morality and ethics as well, of whose story arc we dive into, and finds that sense of compassionate engagement with, and identity or community beyond that as well, that is othered.
Yeah, I mean, reality TV it's propaganda. It's that's why it exists. I think it exists to teach us. I mean, you watch something like The Bachelor, and you see who deserves love, and it's always the same kind of person. It's always a straight white woman, usually blonde, who has very low self-esteem until the Bachelor comes in and validates her. There's a lot of conversation on reality TV dating shows about who's there for the right reasons, which means to get married and have children. It's 2020, like what's going on? Bisexuality in particular is used in a very specific way in reality TV, which is to titillate. Bisexual women are always over-sexualized in these shows. And they would definitely never be allowed to win if one can win reality TV, which you can't.
Do you see there's much crossover between the ideas of, I mean, your work as a performance artist, really, crossing over between reality TV and into the art worlds? Are there any similarities or sort of common threads that you see being played out there in terms of how we build and foster community within Australian arts industry or more locally as well?
To diverge slightly, I did another performance work where I spent a year competing in beauty pageants, and I changed everything about myself, my appearance, every day, all day, every day. It was a complete overhaul of my life, and I started thinking a lot about signaling and how we signal to people that we're like-minded, how we signal to our community that we belong to each other. The more I changed my appearance, the less I felt like I belonged at openings. Completely ostracized myself. I began signaling to the people that I had previously signaled to that I was like them and that I belonged, that I didn't belong, and that was really strange. And also, interestingly, awards in the art world, prizes. I started thinking a lot about the structure of the art prize, the many upholding the singular, and what that means as a community when it puts us directly in competition with each other. So that was something that I thought about a lot during the making of these two projects.
Yeah, thank you, Georgia. Thanks for sharing those thoughts. I think there are some really interesting analogies to be drawn between that. Roberta, I'd like to invite you into the conversation as well with your work that's participating in this year's award. Your work, your practice maybe at large explores constructions of identity, often referencing your Southern African diaspora identity and those experiences. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this work that's in the award and the narratives of diversity that sought through archiving or separation and anarchiving, as you phrase it as well.
So the work that's in the Incinerator Art Award, Our Time, African Faces, African Unionism and Democracy, was very much as part of a larger series, but looking at, I guess, how histories are collected or represented to us. So a lot of my work at large has been a sustained exploration of language and how that intersects with representation, and how the complexity of identity and various identities are represented or spoken for or spoken about. So the works, which are like clear or transparent acrylic panels, have a print that's been extracted from a collection of research publications that I found while I was in South Africa, in Johannesburg, quite randomly. And it kind of felt like this gold of, you know, I can learn more about, you know, the histories that inform my identity and the place where I am now and why I'm here and now. But as I continued to unravel them, it became more and more apparent that these kind of publications were very much historians or ethnographers or anthropologists speaking about communities that are not consulted or not a part of that process of telling stories or writing these histories. So it made sense for me to use the original kind of essence of what I'd found, but then intersect that with my own personal narrative. So on the 4 panels, there's a repeated image of my mother when she's quite young, and she's kind of pulling this really funny like gesture, but it's like a gesture I see of strength or like pride in oneself. And so, and the titles of these were not the original titles, so I've erased some of the text and manipulated the cover so that it creates or hopes to possess like empowered and positive representation of African identity and what that could be.
It's sort of, you know, is it so much so of necessarily rewriting history, or more so extracting out truths that haven't been written into history or been like misappropriated? I mean, even the materiality of like the artwork allows us to see through certain things and to maybe make more apparent things that have been kept invisible, and some of those ideas surrounding identity politics and colorisms as well.
Yeah, I think at the time of making these works, I'm very much interested in presence and absence, and what truths, as you say, become or apparent or are then taken as fact, and what things are not necessarily discussed or I guess looked upon. I mean, exploring these kind of representations in my work was a way of me to try and navigate and understand my place, I guess, in the world. And it very much started as a kind of solo journey, but then now I'm connecting much more with people within the diaspora community and their experiences, because, yeah, I guess particularly with colorism and these conversations that are quite complex, and how they also relate to how Black identity exists within this particular context that we're all living in as well. My Southern African diaspora background is not necessarily visually apparent, so these kinds of questions that I experienced within a very saturated Anglo-Saxon small town would lead me to have these kind of further explorations of like, well, what is an experience of brownness or Blackness, and what is it supposed to look like? And while doing this, at the same time acknowledging, you know, my light-skinnedness and what privileges that gives me as well, but then also being affirmed in that identity too, and how can, for others who may identify with this particular place, have these kinds of conversations as well, which I think, and, you know, I don't want to speak for, but I feel like within the context of so-called Australia as well, and the ugly language that's been historically used, like, I don't even want to say, but, you know, like these half-castes and these kinds of things, and how like media and education systems then inform our understanding of identity, or how we communicate with one another. So, yeah, like what Shal was saying before as well, it really is within these education systems, and how that's the beginning where, when these start to actually make major systemic changes, that we'll be able to access or understand the complexities of one another much better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the those notions of assimilation as well certainly say that there is a lack of inclusivity that brings through cultural practice that is very much, as we've spoken about a lot today, through language. And that the education system as well historically has done this in terms of setting up a certain type of person to be able to be accepted, institutionalized and graduated into the community. And that is not something for all to be sort of invited to participate into. So I want to maybe open up the floor a little bit more so that we can maybe unpack finally some ideas that we have spoken about this morning, and how we see ideas of intersectionality or of artistic practices, or potentially within certain like art space frames, having ramifications to dismantle some of the oppression that many of us are talking about when it comes to talking of identity and community.
Shall I start because my mic's unmuted, or, oh, sorry.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, you know, if we have a better understanding of how intersectional experiences are to understanding privileges and simultaneous oppressions and such, then we are able to like Alham was saying before, connect through our differences. When I was watching Alham's video last night, I couldn't help at certain moments think of, you know, the struggles during apartheid and how these kinds of memories come up. So how through many of our practices, finding those places where they intersect, but also recognising the differences as well, and checking our own bias and accountability.
Alham, how do you, I mean, like that really underscores that sense of the emotional journey that you are trying to articulate in your work as well, and potentially the power that art holds as well to demonstrate a compassionate togetherness while celebrating difference and diversity.
100%. And I think it really comes down to connecting on an emotional level sometimes. That is quite a universal language in itself, you know, grief, loss, happiness, all these things we experience and actually resonate with so many other histories, other cultures. And I think it's important to actually recognize that, acknowledge that we all are human. At the end of the day, we all have a heart, we all have eyes, ears, you know, at the most basic level. So to connect on that emotional level and being able to reflect on yourself in your own space is incredibly important as well. And I think that's exactly it. Thank you, Roberta. Yeah.
Thank you, Alham, as well. Shell, absolutely. Shell, you were you had something that you wanted to mention or comment on before.
Me?
Did you?
Oh, I think I'm okay. Yeah,
Okay.
I got a little bit distracted. I guess it was the answer that I wanted to sort of share with you all. I think it's really important with the oppression removal. Like, for instance, we need to be able to change the attitudes. Like, I'll give you an example, like being a student that requires access. So we need to make sure that there is empowerment within the university to be able to allow people to have that access. So it starts with the levels of educators, coordinators, administrators, so that we can give those opportunities rather than hiding those opportunities, or like, and as we've said before, starting in that education sphere, to allow those opportunities rather than oppression. And listening to all of the stories today, I was like, wow, that really impacted all of us similarly. Like, our experiences within our different spheres are really similar. So there is a connection between all of them. And communication, like you said before, communication and language is really open. And I've got one more question from Jessie. She's asked me that what we can do as deaf people to be able to help others to connect to the hearing world and hearing people, and the reputation and authority to make a change as well. And it's advocacy for social change. And I think the Incinerator Award is really, really great to allow us to have this platform to be able to speak and to spread that word further, like we've all been doing today. And I really hope as well that I can send my project out to the education system to be able to open, once the galleries are open, to be able to see that out there, to create that awareness and that acknowledgement within what's happening in the education system and what's happening in work, and that people see that and can go, oh, we might need to change things. We might need to look at how we can be more open and aware of how we educate and the impact that we can have for the community. And I think art can create a big change for all of us. Art can lead the change.
Thank you, Jessie. That's a phenomenal observation. That's certainly what the award seeks to do. Thank you, Shell, as well, for delivering that message through Jessie, who made that comment in the chat. I think that it's a really nice place to potentially end our conversation, but were there any final thoughts from the rest of the artists today?
Debbie. I was thinking identity, when we balance identity versus community, I feel like identity comes as a mixture of a sense of belonging and alienation, right? And I don't think, and I wonder whether how much of our identities are actually loyal to community, right? And how that determines how we behave. And also what role we play within the community, and then can community withstand and also welcome our disruptions. You know, I feel like besides, yes, of course, the role that we're playing in art and how we are putting certain issues on a platform and say celebrating it as well. I feel it also takes, it basically is an act of acknowledgement of how many blockages there are for us to actually permeate past that. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think, you know, as artists and within the Western canon, where it's very much like the artist, the individual, and these kind of things that come from it as well. But then artists putting forward within their practices, perhaps issues that surround their community. And then I guess it makes me think of what then happens once it leaves the gallery, you know, or what are the kind of things that, you know, artists can do as well as beyond the gallery, or is the community brought into the gallery? And I think these are things that are starting to emerge, or if we think about, you know, involving community within an arts practice, that's like nothing, you know, about us without us, and these kinds of thoughts as well. So yeah, it's the question or statement you posed, Dev, is really interesting, because I think that sometimes there are, I guess, works, or the way the institution may want to curate works within a space that then what happens once the exhibition's finished or whatnot.
Yeah, and I think certainly the sense of collaboration is really put to underscore there as well. And collaboration is something that is a relationship that's slowly built over time, and that's where the space of intersection may be felt. You know, we're talking a lot about feeling and emotion within a space, and to acknowledge privilege and to acknowledge senses of welcoming spaces that can exist. That seems certainly, not historically, but moving forward, a gallery space is a space for that, and how that becomes a model, or is a model, in fact, for a broader society, or can be a leading example on how to shift gears to create more community, collaborative, and inclusive spaces. Fantastic. Any final thoughts? No? Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm sure that these conversations are not just for this time frame that we've set for today, and I would really welcome for our conversations to continue through further chats or messages that might occur throughout the award, and certainly beyond the Incinerator Art Award. It's been an absolute pleasure working with each of you and all of the artists in this year's Incinerator Art Award, moving a very exciting annual award into a digital space. I think that we've made a phenomenal exhibition altogether. So I'd like to thank all of you for your conversations and for your thoughts in joining us today. I would like to thank you for offering us the opportunity to dive deeper into your artistic practices, especially surrounding the theme identity and community. I would also encourage our viewers to visit the Incinerator Art Award website to learn more about this year's award and the artists involved. The exhibition will be running until the 1st of November. You can visit incineratorgallery.com.au to learn more. And please stay tuned for the next video coming up into today's symposium. Thank you.